Welcome back. We're on episode 6 of our series called Group Identity, Thriving in Community. And this is, I guess, part 3 of 4.
Yes.
And we are looking at different character traits that make up what we call group identity. And they're basically character traits that are modeled by Jesus that a group of Jesus followers, that's the church, should emulate for each other. So far we've talked about Bible reading, compassion, kindness, and humility. And today we're going to be talking about gentleness.
That's right. Why don't we just what is gentleness? I think that's probably just a great way to start this whole thing off.
Yeah, to get a sort of definition that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So in preparation for this, I looked up sort of a modern definition of gentleness, and it's the quality of being kind, tender, or mild-mannered. Some call it a softness of action or effect, lightness, the gentleness of his touch. And I think that is definitely part of what the authors meant. I think in translation, the modern word only captures a particular aspect of it and not all of it. And it's also commonly translated as meek. So I looked up that definition, and that's the definition of meek is quiet, gentle, and easily imposed on, and being submissive. So, well, again, the modern definition of meek, I think being quiet and gentle is accurate to the original meaning. The easily imposed on and submissive aspect is, I think, a more recent evolution of the word, and definitely not what the biblical authors were talking about. Meekness is definitely not weakness or passivity. True meekness, however, is just the opposite. It requires great strength and self-control while being gentle and quiet. And by quiet, I mean not overreacting to circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to say it. I think we can obviously, with the idea of quiet is not to say anything, as opposed to changing that, the idea of not being reactive.
Yeah. So when we talk about, we're going to use meekness and sort of gentleness interchangeably in parts here, but our definition then comes down to having great strength and self-control while being gentle and quiet.
Yeah. All right.
Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on was just like when we were talking about in our last series about compassion and kindness being two sides of the same coin, it turns out that meekness and gentleness always come from a state of humility. And I know you preached on humility last Sunday, so maybe just give us a few highlights of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously when we're looking at humility, we're looking at Jesus, and Jesus really exuded this throughout his entire life. And I'm not going to break down kind of what I broke down on Sunday, but I just sort of, even if we look at the fact that where he taught and spent a lot of time in his ministry, he in the more obscure spaces, not the major hubs or prestigious areas where you think, well, you got to go there, and the people he talked to, and we're teaching often were kind of the people of lower status, and so you see that, and when we kind of get to humility in the understanding of basically, even though if anyone can think highly of themselves, it should have been Jesus. And he really taught us about humility. It's really about seeing ourselves as we really are. It's not seeing ourselves with sort of an elevated or inflated sense of self-importance and self-interest.
Yeah.
Therefore, stuff like arrogance, narcissism. And especially at the expense of others.
That's a key point.
Yeah. So actually, elevating yourself at the expense of others. But humility is also not the opposite. I think sometimes we can think it's the idea of thinking ourselves lower than we should have.
Yeah,
therefore,
so self-depreciation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Or it just really undervaluing ourselves, which is actually just a form of false humility.
Yeah.
So what humility does is helps us not to be blinded by our own self-interest and importance, so that we are able to see the value and truly serve others. So that's why humility is such an important foundation when it comes to other virtues and identities, because it's really it's about serving others. It's not about us, and it's not about our needs getting in the way of truly seeing how we can be of service to others. And so therefore, really, humility is the foundation of gentleness.
It has to be. Otherwise, it comes off as, I'm only doing this because I get something out of it.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think real gentleness comes from a state of humility.
Yeah.
So I think the two are linked.
They're very much linked.
Just like compassion and kindness. So if we put all of those things together to sort of get a broader definition of gentleness as a virtue, it means having great strength and self-control and humility while being gentle towards others and composed even in troubling circumstances. And famous pastor Andy Stanley says, gentleness is lending your strength to others.
Yeah, that's a
So
really
it's
good.
a
That's a really
simpler
good
one, but I really wanted to go through that process to get the idea that whenever we read the Bible and we read words like gentleness and we think we know what they mean, we're lots of times thinking about our modern definitions of the words. And so it's obviously helpful, I think, to read different translations, because different translations will oftentimes use different words around the same idea, so you get a broader picture of it. And there's tons of free available online Bible study tools that help us understand the original text or language the Bible was written in.
Well, one of the things that I kind of came across when just thinking about and reading about humility, and I think this really applies to understanding gentleness, because I think sometimes we can still, see gentleness in a very limited way, and especially when you're talking about gentleness does mean having great strength. It's great strength without domination.
Yes.
And it's the domination part that is, where we start to remove gentleness from the equation. Still great strength, but with no domination.
Yeah, and that's key. That's what I was trying to get at with the self-control bit.
Yeah.
But that's way better, because our society is very trying to dominate.
It's trying to dominate, even manipulate, all that sort of stuff.
To
and
get
gentleness,
ahead,
it's not. It's
the opposite of
that.
Yeah. So as we've been doing in this series, we kind of look at, we've said that Jesus is the center of our group identity. So we're going to look at some examples of Jesus being gentle. So the first story that comes to mind is Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. Jesus was teaching in the temple and gets interrupted by the religious leaders who brought a woman in who was caught in adultery. My first question in my mind was, where is the man? Because according to the Torah, such a woman and man would be liable for the death penalty. But even in Jesus' time, this was rarely ever enforced. So we have to keep that in the back of our mind. So what are they trying to accomplish by doing this? Well, the Jewish leaders are trying to discredit and humiliate Jesus in front of the crowd. They remind Jesus in front of the crowd that the letter of the law requires the death penalty. They're kind of trying to create a no-win situation for Jesus. If he shows mercy, then he doesn't uphold the law. And if he upholds the law, then he's not merciful. And they can make him look bad either way. Jesus kind of initially ignores them, but they keep badgering him until he finally replies. And then Jesus kind of sees through their deception, and he finds a way to actually save the woman and actually humiliate the religious leaders. It's a fascinating story, and you can read it in John chapter 8. But the part I want to focus in on here that shows gentleness is Jesus' interaction with the woman after the religious leaders have left. Jesus says to her in John 8, 10, 11, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them stay to condemn you?" "No, Lord," she replied. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." Now, again, we might think that sounds harsh, but Jesus remains calm and composed under pressure. He doesn't get upset or angry, and he certainly isn't submissive or passive. He stands up to the religious leaders. He shows the woman dignity and agency in asking her if anyone is still accusing her. And then he's gentle in his response, saying that he doesn't accuse her either, but he reminds her that her actions have potentially dire consequences.
Well, and that's where I think we see so much of this, again, gentleness and then this foundation of humility in this moment. Because one, even though when we hear the story, it's this woman is caught in adultery, it's never about the woman.
No.
And she is a pawn.
Yep.
Pawn in the agenda of these religious leaders that are trying to trap him. And therefore she's not even really seen as anything other than that. And really that speaks to like how they're viewing her as really a non-entity.
Yeah.
As a pawn in this whole thing. And it's really the gentleness that we see and how he responds to her is that he's also seeing her as a human. As like you are a victim in this whole thing, and this has nothing to do with
I've even read that Jewish scholars sometimes feel that the religious leaders were actually setting the woman up just so they could bring her to Jesus and make this accusation.
Yeah, and so like just the fact that in that same situation, anyone could have been easy of could have been so much where just like Jesus just said, "How dare you put me in a position like this? I know what you're doing." But in this whole thing, like how he does it, he actually gives her some sense of worth and treats her with some gentleness. Yeah. And that gentleness was not only how he, in how he did it, but the fact that he saw her as a human.
I really like that. All right, let's move on to a second example. Jesus is talking. He's sort of on a teaching tour, and there were stories of Matthew recorded by Matthew in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11. Jesus is sort of wrapping up a teaching session on a teaching tour, and he's inviting people to follow him. And he says in Matthew 11:28-30, Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you," which is a sort of an animal husbandry kind of a tool for the connecting oxen together.
Two together, yeah.
Plowing. So he's saying, take my yoke. So he's going to help you. Let me teach you because I am humble and gentle. So there's the two things together we talked about. And you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. So Jesus even describes himself as humble and gentle. And I think one of the most beautiful ways he demonstrates this is at his crucifixion.
Yeah, absolutely.
He obviously has great power and strength. He tells his disciples that he could call 12 legions of angels to defeat his enemies at a single request to God his Father. Now, this is a lot. I mean, a Roman legion was 4,200 foot soldiers and 300 on horseback. So times 12, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And he has that at a single command, but he doesn't do that. He stays on, he submits to his oppressors, which was part of his mission, but he's not really passive. He allows it to happen, but if you read the story in the Gospels, he confronts the Jewish leaders and even provokes them by affirming that he is actually the Messiah, which makes them really angry. When he comes to the Roman governor Pilate, it's a kind of a strange interaction because Pilate is used to having his way. He's not known as a nice guy, and he doesn't really like the Jews or his position there. So he kind of has it out for them a little bit. But when he confronts Jesus and says, I have the power to kill you if you want, you're going to talk to me. And Jesus says, you have no control over me at all other than what God gives you. And Pilate is quite shaken by this and tries to release him. So Jesus in this situation is not passive or submissive, but he does allow the circumstances to happen because that's what he's there for. I think he shows great composure and calm while he completes his mission, which involves him being tortured and crucified. And then there's these 2 or 3 interactions that you can read about where Jesus speaks gently and shows compassion and kindness, one to the thief on the cross beside him.
Yeah.
I mean, initially the 2 thieves were, can't just save us and save yourself. And they're making fun of him and everybody's, kind of humiliating Jesus. And then one thief has kind of a change of heart. And Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. The soldiers that are crucifying him and splitting up his clothes and throwing dice for them, he tells them, he prays on their behalf and says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing.
Yeah. And
then there's this other one. It's in the Gospel of John where he actually arranges for the care of his mother with John.
That's right.
For after he's gone. And I thought these are 3 very distinct times where Jesus is showing gentleness and compassion and kindness at the sort of worst moment of his life. And so I thought that kind of really models for me what it means to be meek and gentle.
Yeah, even in the midst of great discomfort, pain, whatever you want to say that. Yeah. Discomfort seems a little underwhelming.
That's but crucifixion was very painful.
It was very painful. And the fact that gentleness was still a huge part of his identity in that moment. Because I think very often, and I definitely put myself in this category, if I'm experiencing some sort of, I'm going to use the word discomfort because that's really probably accurate.
Yeah.
Like my gentleness with people tends to
disappear. Yeah.
And I become
That's
like harsh and sharp and whatnot.
It's a very
and
natural
sort of
thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah. And just like, and even in the midst of that, gentleness can still happen, even while we are in whatever distress we might be going through.
Yeah. So is gentleness for followers of Jesus today? Well, the Apostle Paul in his letter to the early churches in Galatia, he says their church community should be guided by the Holy Spirit, and that will produce a character change in us. So in Galatians 5:22 chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, we talks about the fruit of the Spirit. So the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So gentleness is an attribute of the church, or followers of Jesus. So it is part of our identity as a group. So I was trying to think of some examples, and I can remember when my kids were smaller and they were toddlers, sometimes they get run over with emotions, and I'm sure every parent listening to this will relate to this. And sometimes you just got to sit and hold them until they calm down.
Yeah.
And to me, that's shows that gentleness is a way to help them learn to deal with their emotions.
Well, it could be really helping and regulating. Because I think sometimes, and I've definitely made the mistake, when there is a dysregulation in emotions, is then allowing our own emotions to dysregulate.
Stop
and
that.
It's more that dominating sort of like, we're just, and very seldom does that make it. It might stop what's going on, but it didn't make it better.
No, definitely not. And quite often it just escalates the situation.
Yeah. And gentleness sometimes, I think, like when you start with this, I think we can take it to a lot of different scenarios. The gentleness doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get the immediate response we want, but it does. But often I think what it means is that we can get a lasting, deeper, and more, I think, rooting to the actual problem that really it can be solving, especially when you think using the scenario of kids and all that sort of stuff. Definitely you can get there deeper.
Yeah.
When gentleness is used as opposed to that. So I think sometimes we have to realize that gentleness is about rooting to the foundation of an issue, of a problem, of a thing going on. Whereas when we don't use gentleness, when we use harshness, it's more about just stopping the thing immediately, as opposed to allowing healing and processing and all that sort of stuff.
Well said. Free parenting advice today. So the other thing,
and it's beyond parenting. I mean, I think it's like when we go to say a counselor.
Yeah.
There are definitely times when you need to hear a hard thing, but usually it's much more gentle because it's trying to get you to a place of healing and processing. Yeah. And it's just more often that is better got through gentleness than it is through a slammed fist on a table.
Yeah, admonishment.
Like,
something.
Oh, you need to, sometimes we need to be gently guided to those moments.
That. Well said. The other thing that I was thinking of is more of a practical example. And I know in our church community, there's a couple, David and Faith, and I know they faithfully, no pun intended, pick up one of our senior ladies and drive her to church, or to and from church every week. Now, she's elderly and uses a walker, and she needs strength from David just to move from her house into the vehicle, and then from the vehicle into church, and then the opposite on the end. And I thought, I see this as David lending his strength to Bev in order for her to attend church. And I thought, to me, that's it's a small thing really in the scale of dramatic things that we could say. But to me, I see that as a real attribute of gentleness that I see in them towards Bev. And that kind of really struck me as a good example for that.
That's really good. Well, we've talked a little bit through this aspect, this group identity of gentleness. And we just really encourage you to continue to reflect on that. And I'm going to ask you to reflect in kind of two ways. One, I want you to self-reflect, and this is going to take some humility when we've not acted in a gentle way towards someone. Mm-hmm. Now, remember, when it comes to humility, it's good. Humility is about looking at our weaknesses, not about knocking ourselves down.
Exactly.
But about seeing our weaknesses so where we can grow and being honest with ourselves. It's about growing. And the whole idea is again, where have we not acted in a gentle way to someone, and maybe why? Why did we not do that?
Yeah. Then
I do want to encourage you to, at some point this week, think about how you can show gentleness. And I'm going to use the definition that Ron used. Where can you lend your strength to someone this week?
Put it into practice. Yep.
So find a place to do that. Find someone you can do that. And it doesn't need to be something huge and big. When it comes to the group identity, I think one of the things is, again, we can sometimes talk about a big story of this, but when it's an identity, it's an everyday thing. It's going to happen in the big stories. It's going to happen in the little stories too.
Everyday faithful, doing it every week.
That's right.
Kind of situations are, to me, they're almost the bigger.
They are the big. Yeah. It's the million little things.
Yeah, the million little things like that.
Thank you so much for joining us in this series of Thriving Community, specifically looking at group identity as one of the essential soils needed for having a great community. We really just hope that this is something that we are growing in together. We really want to be a thriving community that follows Jesus. Thank you. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.